I'm focusing on the practical skill of making points. First, a little bit about me. I started smithing in 2009, and I really, really struggled. But where I was able to practice blacksmithing, I had to bring a friend with me. And so I started informally teaching blacksmithing pretty soon after I started learning blacksmithing myself. In 2015, I started Miss Caitlin's School of Blacksmithing, where I'm teaching full-time, almost exclusively beginners or folks that are coming to me with more experience, really focusing on the basics. And in 2018, I was part of the Society of Inclusive Blacksmiths founding meeting. And it's something that I'm super passionate about, inclusivity, because I really struggled when I was first getting started in blacksmithing. And that's part of sort of the intrinsic drive that I have for making sure that folks really understand how to teach the basics so that more folks like me who really struggled at the very beginning can continue on in blacksmithing and increase the diversity in the field. Nowadays, I'm teaching up to 32 students per week. This is a little bit about my core beliefs and teaching philosophy. What I've noticed over the years is that students have extremely limited attention. And I'm not even talking about, this modern age of cell phones and internet distraction. I'm talking about the idea that we really can't actually multitask on things. And for beginners, it's especially challenging to remember multiple instructions simultaneously, especially if they haven't kind of gotten one of the instructions down. It's really hard for them to pick up another. As instructors, I'm sure you're familiar with telling students really clearly, don't hit on the metal when it's not glowing hot, and then just to turn around a few minutes later and find out that they're hitting the metal when it's stone cold. And this can be really frustrating for us as instructors because it seems like our students simply aren't listening to us, right? But what I have noticed from that is that my students are absolutely doing the best that they can, but that there's so much information for them to take in that it's really difficult for them to take it all in simultaneously. So from that perspective, I want to be giving concise and clear instructions, provide very useful feedback and clarification, and teach the students to recognize when things are actually going wrong and then how to correct it so they can have as much autonomy and understanding of the process as possible. Another really core understanding that I have about teaching is that students really learn at very different rates. There are so many students that come to my classes with absolutely no background in any tooling whatsoever, like they've never picked up a hammer before. They have spent most of their life looking at a computer screen. They really don't have even that three-dimensional understanding of how the universe works, right? And so those students have a much more challenging time getting into learning some of the basics in comparison to folks that, they've been hammering all their life. They've done woodworking, they've done a bunch of skills that are really similar to blacksmithing in terms of like using tools, in terms of handling hot metal, that sort of thing. There's a much lower learning curve for those folks than the folks that are absolute rank beginners in every sense. So I really want to make sure that those students who are struggling to learn are being taught in the same calm, patient manner that the folks that are sort of blazing through the curriculum are taught, but make sure that the folks that are struggling are able to still see noticeable progress in what they're doing. In other words, don't throw too much at them all at once where they're just going to melt down with the load of what they're trying to remember. It's been my experience that the students who struggle to learn end up learning far more because they have to know this stuff explicitly, whereas somebody who sort of comes in and they kind of got it already, they're not working quite as hard, right? And so they don't have to know the information explicitly. They just make a point, right? They don't have to know what all goes into it. And I really feel very strongly that supporting struggling students helps to foster diversity in the craft. And this is the project that we're starting with. This is a Ms. Caitlin School style hook. This is the project that I start my students with no matter how much experience they have coming in the door, because it helps us to establish a common vocabulary. All of the elements of the hook. So I've got kind of an interesting vocabulary here. You'll see that I've got words like smush and bend. And so as I'm talking with the students, I'm really identifying what processes we're using here. And we're going to be focusing on that point, which is part of the piece that I call the blaze, sort of the candle shape part at the top with the rivet in it. Why focus on point? Well, it's been my experience that points are sort of the hardest aspect of this particular project. In my standard, runs about 2 to 2.5 hours, depending. And typically, students will take between 15 minutes and 45 minutes to do a point, just depending upon where they're coming from in terms of background. That is by far and away the largest amount of time for any skill that's being developed in this particular project. And if there's any one skill that's not fully present, it can make it really difficult for the students to be able to get a point that's actually pointy at the end. Before we dive into points, I want to talk vocabulary. When I say the word smush, I'm using the word kind of as a technical term, right? I should be using the term forge, like forge the end of the bar, but like the forge is the part that heats things up, and the whole shebang's called forging. So I like to call it smush because people kind of understand what that means, right? And then when we're talking about smushing, it's always happening between the hammer and the anvil, and it's changing the cross-section of the metal. And it really needs to be worked while the metal is glowing, right? We're rearranging atoms here. Bending does not change the cross-section, and it always happens into space. It can be worked a little bit cooler, but of course we got to watch out for metal fatiguing in more complicated projects. Another note before we really dive into points, I really focus on things like position at the anvil, because I oftentimes have students who come up to the anvil and they stand about as far away as they possibly can from it. And this is a really natural thing, right? When my students stand really far away from the anvil, it's because they've been trained their entire lives to stay away from the dangerous stuff, right? And so by standing far away from the hot metal that they're holding, they feel like they're doing something safe for themselves. But it totally destroys the body mechanics. And there are things that will show up later in making the point that make it a little bit harder to make a good point if you're standing too far away from the anvil. So as you see in this picture, this is sort of a top-down picture. It might be a little challenging to see. I've basically got the hammer hand leg close to the anvil on the right-hand side. I'm right-handed. And the tong leg, or the non-dominant leg, is sort of at the midline of the anvil. So the whole angle of how I'm standing is at an angle to the anvil, and you end up having sort of a right angle hold of the metal across the anvil. The metal's going perpendicular to the edge of the anvil, and that really is a pretty good place for the students to start at, right? If they're standing at the end of the anvil, they're oftentimes trying to get as far away from that hot metal as possible. And if they stand a lot closer, like seen here in this picture, I find that the outcomes are a lot better. And we can kind of dive into that further if folks have questions. I really want to hammer this point home, pun intended. Beginners work so much harder than we do. They work so much harder because they're trying to remember all the things. When we're making points, literally all we're doing is looking to see if something's going wrong. But a beginner is trying to remember to hit hard enough, to aim in the right spot, to hold the piece of metal in the right place, to rotate it a full quarter turn each time. There's so much happening here. This is the minimum skill set that I consider is required to make a stabby point. And this slide is meant to be a lot of information because this is the sort of stuff that folks are actually trying to remember. Our students can feel very overwhelmed if we identify exactly what has to go into those points. It's really, really hard for a lot of my students to come in and hit hard enough to actually smush the metal. And I spend a lot of time in my classes making sure that folks are able to do just that, because I believe that you cannot learn to aim if you cannot see where your hammer is landing. And I really believe that hitting hard does not require upper body strength. I teach my students to use gravity and inertia, raising the hammer higher and keeping the arm as relaxed and loose as possible. What I'm talking about here, and I'm going to attempt, it was so hard to get the screen share to work, but let me bring myself back into view here. Aha. So I just want to take a second here and show you something that I have worked on. So for me, it's really important for folks to understand that the physics of using the hammer don't necessarily require you to use a lot of strength. Down happens, right? And so what happens here, I have a scale model of my intern's arm. And it's sort of rigged up as a little puppet device here, right? To sort of show the upper arm, the lower arm, the hand, and how the hammer might even move within the hand. So we've got a whole series of joints that are all coming together to let that hammer drop. So what we really need to do to get more potential energy in is to raise that hammer up higher and let it fall. And let me tell you, this is not set up right now for me to drop this safely, but it packs a heck of a wallop, right? So you can see here that we're basically accelerating, starting from that shoulder with the elbow, with the wrist, with the movement in the hand, and it's all coming together to land that hammer down with quite a lot of force. And so I've got so many students that come in and they're telling me, oh, I just don't think I can do this. I don't think I'm strong enough. Well, if you've got an arm and you've got a hammer, down just happens, right? The main challenge with getting folks to hit hard enough actually is getting them to hold the hammer loosely enough to be able to feel that gravity and inertia take hold. So one of the things that is really important is the shape of the hammer handle, that it's narrower closer to the head and wider further down, so that it acts as a wedge and it stays in your hand even if you're not holding that hammer really tightly. That means that basically you don't have to grip the hammer all that tightly, which means that your forearm, where all of the muscles of your hand can be much more relaxed, so that you're not causing repetitive stress injuries on your arm and preventing that hammer from falling effortlessly. So once we get folks hammering hard, Then we start talking about aim, right? Because the thing is that to hammer hard, you need to raise that hammer up a little bit higher. And when you do that, you lose the ability to aim pretty well. And so there's a couple of things that actually help to get that aim back, even though we're tapping into those big forces like gravity and inertia. And the number one thing is what we're doing with our eyes. To go back to that statement, if you can't see where your hammer is landing, it's really, really tough to learn how to aim. And so we need to be hitting hard enough to make a noticeable dent in the material. And we have to be able to track with our eyes what's actually happening with that hammer. Now, I want you to notice here, one of the things that happens is that we get right into reaction time here. I don't know if you did the same sort of thing that I did when I was learning driver's ed. They had us test our reaction time. And it's surprisingly not fast, right? And so if you are dropping that hammer so quickly that it's faster than your reaction time, there is absolutely no way that you're going to be able to learn from what happened to that hammer or what happened to that metal with that last hammer blow. You're going to be delayed. So slowing things right down so you can actually see where your hammer is landing, absolutely crucial to developing that aim. And folks don't want to come in and relax and drop that hammer down nice and slow because they see folks on TV all the time hammering as fast as they possibly can. But slowing things down helps to do with that reaction time, and it helps to be able to see. Now, there's a very specific thing with the eyes that I teach people to pay attention to. What I like to say is if you think about if you've ever seen a dog who is absolutely locked on somebody who's about to throw a ball for it, right? That dog is focused on that ball with their every fiber of their being, laser focused on that ball. If that person so much as twitches, that dog knows all about it, right? If you can get your students to focus on the end of the metal as if they're focusing as well as that dog is focusing on the ball, they simply will hit that spot more often. If you think back to what your eyes are actually doing when you're blacksmithing, your eyes are absolutely focused where you want to hit. It's a really particular thing that we do with our eyes pretty naturally when we sort of figure out what we want to be doing with the metal. There's another way of looking at things, which is where your eyes are hitting a bunch of different locations. This is sort of a soft gaze with your eyes. If you look into the science of this, they call these saccades. This is also how folks will read as they sort of jump along the page. If we're looking at like the end of a piece of metal and we're having that sort of soft gaze, our eyes are going to jump around as we're looking at it. And what's going to happen? Our hammer is going to jump around too. But if we can laser focus at the very end of our metal, we simply will hit there more often. And if we don't hit there, we have a sense for where that hammer landed so that we can let that hammer fall, bounce on the anvil, and adjust and land it in a different place and see if it hits better, right? I cannot overstate the importance of what your eyes are doing here. It's been my experience that if folks come in and they're telling me, I don't have any hand-eye coordination, all I have to do is say, oh, you don't know the trick. And as soon as we talk about that trick and what it feels like with your eyes, folks are able to hit with incredible, like breathtaking accuracy. And I can also, as an instructor, I can also walk up to somebody, watch where their hammer's landing, and tell if they're using the eye trick or not. This is really, really powerful. Like probably the single biggest thing that has taken my students from, really struggling to get to develop accuracy to just, rocking and rolling. It's pretty impressive. So I'm going to go back to my slides. All right, hitting hard enough to smush, and then hitting at the end of your metal. This is the aiming part. We need two things. We have to use our laser eyes, and we have to use trial and error. And quite frankly, I have a whole conversation with my students about this. So many students come in with perfectionism. They want to be hitting exactly in the right spot. They don't want to make mistakes. But it's truly my belief that if they are paying attention, every single hammer blow, every single mistake that they make is going to be a better and faster teacher than I could ever possibly be. And so if you really got a student who's open to learning from their mistakes, they are absolutely going to skyrocket past the rest of your students. It's really impressive. And there's a little note on here, if the student's not hitting on the very end of the metal, their point will be quite long. This is one of the things that I find happening pretty often. I'm actually going to switch over to the other view here.
It's really common for beginners to line up their hammer like this. But that ends up meaning that if we're actually looking at what's happening here, I'm just going to rotate this around. You can see that by lining the edge of their hammer up with the very end of their clay, the center of their hammer is actually hitting about a ½ inch back from the end. What that's going to mean when we actually work it is that their hammer is going to be hitting back from the end, and they're not going to get that nice point forming. It's just going to get longer and longer. But if instead they use this edge of the hammer all the way out at the very end, which looks really wrong to a beginner student, you can see that we get a point right away.
This is an interesting one. Keep the end of the metal fully on the anvil.
In order for a student to make a nice pointy point, they have to keep that metal on the anvil. If it ends up extending past that far edge, you're going to end up getting this little notch here where it starts to do a half-faced blow over that edge. Let me make that a little bit more dramatic for us here. So you can see that little notch forming right on that far side. That's just where you've got a half-faced blow. When that happens, it's generally an indication to me that the students are not keeping their eye on the very end of their piece of metal. If they were, they would have automatically kept it in the right spot. They're letting their eyes kind of wander a little bit. They're kind of on autopilot. If you pull it back on the anvil, it's easy enough to correct, but it'll end up making that end much longer than the rest of that point. You can see how this sort of extends unnaturally long because it's gone through that half-faced blow. A lot of times when the student is not paying a lot of attention to what's actually happening here, they can sometimes have their piece of metal kind of floating at the very end, and as they're hitting on it, they can hit down and it's not smushing because it's not actually up against the anvil. And they'll complain that there's nothing really happening there, but that's because there's truly nothing happening except for possibly that the piece of metal is bending on them. In order to get them so that the piece of metal is firmly on the anvil, I'll often suggest that they actually try pressing the end down. So they lift this end just a little bit so that it's pressing it down. Of course, as you're doing that, if you're suggesting this to them, please note that as soon as you're lifting it up off the edge of the anvil and there's space under here, if you are to hit when there's space under there, you're going to end up getting bowing. It'll bend down into that space. So that's really only in situations where the student is actually hitting right where they should be hitting, and they're only lifting it just enough to make sure that it's pressing down at that point. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of bending, and the student will feel that the metal's not being very well controlled. When I'm teaching points, I do often not go into all of these details with a student unless they're having trouble with a particular one of these elements. Generally speaking, students don't end up having trouble with all of these variables simultaneously. They'll usually have trouble with 2 or 3 of them, and then you can correct those as they come up. But asking a student to remember all of this stuff can be very, very overwhelming. Ideally, we want them to only know what they need to know to be able to kind of get the feel for it. And as we go deeper and deeper with them and teach them more and more, we can nerd out with them higher and higher, because they're going to be integrating all of these concepts into their metal moving, which is really kind of neat. Interestingly, this is where a really tight grip on the hammer is not going to give us a lot of good feedback about how that hammer blow is actually landing. If you've got a really tight grip, you're not getting all of that sensory information about how that blow is landing. And so it can actually make it much more difficult for the student to diagnose what's actually going on here.
Keeping the metal square helps to direct the traffic. There's a very different process between rounding the end of your metal when you're making a point and actually doing that drawing out. And when we're trying to efficiently make a point, we want to keep it as square as possible to sort of direct traffic. It makes it much easier for the metal to go where it's supposed to go quickly and easily. It's sort of like, being in a place that you're driving around in that has excellent signage and very clear roads, and everything is very easy to understand, as compared to like not having any signs and the roads are all going in different directions that you don't understand. It's so much more easy if we keep it nice and square. The challenge is there's lots and lots of reasons why it may get off square, including things like the stance at the anvil, height of the anvil, whether they're doing the thing with the eyes, the laser eyes, whether they're sort of landing their hammer at a little bit of an angle, or whether they're landing it across the whole end. There's so many things here that can be really challenging. The good news is, though, that if they're mostly keeping it square, you can get away with it being a little bit diamond shaped or a little bit on the rectangular side, but it's probably not going to happen quite as quickly. So if your student is really struggling with the skills that I was talking about before, please make sure that those skills are as effortless for them as possible, and then dive into this entire concept of keeping the end of the metal square, because there's so much happening here, it can definitely overwhelm the students. And then here we've got just 2 basic ways that it oftentimes gets off of square. If it's rectangular, we want to identify and hit on the narrow facet. I can't tell you how many times my students try to hit on the wider facet because that's the facet that's, quote, wrong. And letting them know that we always want to hit on the narrow facet. When I say narrow facet, I'm talking as you're looking down, the side that appears thinner on the anvil. Teaching them to toggle back and forth between those 2 different sides and comparing the size is a really good basic skill that will help them understand what's going on with the metal. If the metal's gotten diamond shaped, the only difference is that instead of looking for the narrow facet, we're looking for the narrow edge. So here with my pointer, I've got this sort of diamond shaped. We're rolling it around until we see where it takes up the least amount of space on the anvil, hitting on that edge to bring it back in, sort of smush it back in closer to square-ish. We end up getting a 6-sided piece there, and what we're doing is hitting on that edge until there's a facet, and then rotating it a quarter turn from that facet to reestablish the second facet, which sort of combines two of those edges together, and then compare the size of the facets and go from there. Here are some common problems. You've probably seen these happen before. I think the third one down, student tilts the hammer back and forth as they rotate their metal. This is one of the ones that I do want to talk about really briefly. If you can focus on the Anvil view here.
I've seen some really interesting stuff where as the student is rotating it back and forth, they sometimes also rotate their hammer. And this is a really interesting phenomenon that happens, and to me it says an awful lot about what's happening here neurologically, because the brain is getting the signal to rotate something back and forth, but it's applying it to both hands. And so you get some really interesting things happening there when the student is rotating both at the same time. One of the quickest fixes that I know for when the student is rotating both the hammer and the clay at the same time is to really just let them know that no matter what is happening, their hammer should be doing exactly the same thing. The hammer is just hitting down, no matter what's going on with the actual piece of metal.
I always get kind of I love brain stuff, and so I love when that happens, because it kind of gives me a little bit of insight into what's actually happening in one of my students' brains, right? Like, they want to rotate it over, and their brain is telling them to rotate it over, and that movement is just being carried too far. I think it's kind of cool. So, of course, we also have to tilt the hammer slightly to match the slope of the point. But of course, it is possible to get something pointy without tilting the hammer. And of course, sometimes folks will tilt the hammer the, quote, wrong way. I mean, as you see here in this picture, the very center of the hammer is actually not touching the clay at all. So if they were tilting the hammer the other way, the center of the hammer would be touching the very end of their metal. I think this is a really kind of an interesting thing as well. Their brain is just telling them, okay, we've got to tilt the hammer. And in fact, it is a viable way of moving the metal. We're sort of using the edge of the hammer as a peen and drawing it out. But of course, oftentimes students will get the sort of stair-step effect from that and really see some marks on their piece of material. Their point can be drawn out much longer than they intend it to, which is kind of interesting. Keeping the metal at the edge of the anvil. Many students will hit the anvil just above their point. So I'm switching focus back over to the anvil view.
Most students will start off making a point in the middle of the anvil. This is just the most convenient place for them to start. But as they're working, they'll eventually hit the anvil. And when they do that, it's going to make it much more challenging for them to actually get a pointy point. That's just because the hammer is actually hitting the anvil, and that's scrubbing off power from hitting the actual end of the piece of metal itself. So what we want to do is we want to work either at the edge of the anvil or actually out on the horn of the anvil. By working in a place where the anvil sort of falls away, we can accommodate the fact that this edge of the hammer is dipping below the anvil surface, therefore bringing the face of the hammer in direct contact with the piece of metal itself, working it much, much, much finer. You can see as I'm doing this, I'm actually almost just using this tiny little corner of the hammer to get right in there and do some really fine work. One of the things that happens here is that I don't usually tell the student to work the material at the very edge of the anvil until they've gotten far enough in the process where they're starting to hit the anvil. That's just because I don't want to give them too many things to think about all at once. But as soon as they start hitting the anvil, I want to make sure that they're moving their piece all the way out to that far edge or working it on the horn so that they don't keep hitting the anvil as they're going.
I really love this as a thing to call attention to, because it's a really great way to reinforce to students that they're doing something right? It's like, hey, your aim was perfect. It's just that the anvil got in the way, right? And they kind of chuckle and like look a little sheepish a lot of the time. And it's like, actually, your aim was exactly perfect. We just need to move the whole thing out to that far edge, and then you're going to get a really stabby point, which is really cool. So keeping the bar relatively straight is a really interesting thing, because students, when they get stressed or when they have to like pay attention to a lot of information at the same time, their shoulders will go up. It's sort of like if you've ever seen a cat, when it gets scared, they sort of arch their back. We humans do that too. When their shoulders go up, that means that the metal that they're holding is suddenly being held at an angle to the anvil. And that's okay if you're trying to center the point on the bar, for example. But a lot of times, if you've got a student who is not hammering with accuracy at that point, ends up bending the piece of material a lot. It's also, this category also includes if you're making a point on a square bar. This is where you can get a lot of twisting happening. So keeping it relatively straight, like straight enough to get on to the next step, is super helpful, because if your student keeps having to stop and straighten the metal out because it's gotten so wonky that they're having trouble keeping track of it, this can be a real addition to their mental load. It can be really stressful, and they can get very quickly frustrated. Calling attention to keeping their shoulders down and keeping their metal relatively flat will help them reduce that stress quite a bit. There's also a really cool hack to untwisting metal, but we are running very short on time here, so hopefully if we get a chance, I'll go back to it. But notice how far down in the list of things the category of keep the metal hot is. In other words, students have to pay attention to a lot of stuff in priority before noticing the color temperature of the metal. It is really common for them to just delete that information from stuff that they're paying attention to entirely. I've done the thing with my students where I'm like, okay, you really need to be having this glowing. This is a smush. Stop hitting on it as soon as it stops glowing. And then I turn around and they're hitting on something that's completely cold. This is actually the students doing a good job of prioritizing the things that are important and not paying attention to the things that are less important. Because if they couldn't do any of the previous stuff, they're pretty much not getting a point anyway. Keeping the metal hot is kind of a moot point when you get it all the way down here. I'm not saying that it's useless. We obviously have to be working the metal hot. But if they've failed at all of those previous skill sets, keeping the metal hot or working that metal hot at that point is just so much for them to pay attention to. It's only once they've mastered those skills that they can start paying attention to it. All right, and now we're at that point. What can you do to help improve student outcomes? This is my very best trick. Try making points on your own with your hammer and your non-dominant hand. Here's why this is important, and I'm gonna pull up the biggest tip is to practice or at least try making a point with your non-dominant hand. And here's why it's so important. You know how to make points. You have all of that information. You know all of the things that you need to do in the order that you need to do them in. You know all of the troubleshooting routines. But there's another thing that happens, which is that your body has muscle memory. Your brain has developed neural processes that make this faster and easier. If you try this with your non-dominant hand, you wipe all of that stuff off the table and you get a chance to experience this fresh. And I so recommend it. It's such a great opportunity to really see what that experience is for the student. The next thing I recommend is really slowing down. Like, slow down your demonstrating so that as you're hammering, you're taking the time to really raise your hammer up and let it fall with as little effort as possible so that they can really see that they can take the time to actually see what that hammer blow is doing and react to it. See if it's landing in the right spot and react to it. I promise you that if you slow way down, they'll be able to go faster, a lot faster, all right? If you can give the students opportunities to reduce their mental load, reduce distractions, slow it way down, and suggest things like, you know, instead of hitting and turning really quickly, if instead you suggest that they hit at least twice per side, that gives them a second opportunity to get that hammer further out. They stand a slightly better chance of actually hitting on the very end of their metal. If you ever walked into a room and forgotten what you were there for, when you flip your piece of metal over, your brain kind of resets a little. Like, what are we doing on this side, right? So if you have that second opportunity to hit further out, it is often easier for students to nail that second hit. And the other thing is that what we're asking our students to do when we're asking them to make points from a neurological perspective, it's not much different from the thing we all learned as little kids where we pat our head and rub our belly, right? Patting our head is like dropping that hammer. Rubbing our belly is like rotating those tongs. We're asking both hands to do something completely different simultaneously. And if we can really slow it down and invite our students to hit, pause, rotate, hit, pause, rotate. Slowing it way down, it's going to make it so much faster and easier for them to pick it up going forward. The bottom line is this. This is the best part of this, is that what happens in our brains in order to make this faster and easier is that we try it once and it's hard. And then our brains go, oh, we need a neural pathway to make that faster and easier. And all the students need to do is sleep and then try it again. When they sleep, the brain builds those neural pathways. When they try it again, the brain reinforces those pathways. I've seen so many folks go from, I don't know how to do this, it's taking me 45 minutes to do it, to being able to do it in 15 minutes the next class. It's really pretty miraculous. And if you just remind them, all you need to do is sleep and try this again, it will come faster and easier. It's truly one of the best ways, I think, to hack the brain and make it much easier for folks to engage with doing this skill. There's so much here that I didn't get a chance to say, but now I would love to take your questions.